So when we started last week, Scott was talking about the fact that if you recall, chronologically, before the start of 1 Samuel, there's the book of Judges. And you remember that at the end of that book, it describes what's going on amongst these tribes in Israel, right? So there's chaos. Each person was doing what was right in his own eyes. And so that's kind of the context as we start here in 1 Samuel chapter 1. So let's start reading. 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 1. There was a certain man of Ramathaim Zophim of the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, the son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, son of Tohu, son of Zuph, an Ephrathite. He had two wives. The name of the one was Hannah, and the name of the other Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. So I'll pause here. If this was a secular book, if this wasn't the Bible, and you had just finished a chapter that read that there was this chaos and turbulence and tumultuous in the tribes of Israel, I would expect the next chapter, the next section in the book, to then give me an explanation for what's going to happen next, right? We all know that this is the book that's going to introduce the nation of Israel with a king. So you might expect there to be this kind of broad, sweeping, overarching explanation of, well, here's how this is going to play out, and here's how the kingdom is going to come into fruition, and here's how we're going to find a king. So it's somewhat surprising to me that we actually start in this kind of obscure place, right? We start with a guy that we've never heard of thus far in the Old Testament, Elkanah, and he's living in a town that it's not a Jerusalem, it's not a Jericho or a Bethlehem or one of these places that you might easily recognize. It's a city that I don't know anything about. And we're just told that he has two wives. One has children, one does not. So as we keep reading here, starting verse 3, try to pay attention to how this story is told. It's told in this very empathetic way where we're really made to understand the helplessness of the situation that his wife is in. So let's read starting in verse 3. Now this man used to go up year by year from his city to worship and to sacrifice to the Lord of hosts at Shiloh, where the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were priests of the Lord. On the day when Elkanah sacrificed, he would give portions to his wife and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he gave a double portion because he loved her, though the Lord had closed her womb. And her rival used to provoke her grievously, to irritate her, because the Lord had closed her womb. So it went on year by year. As often as she went up to the house of the Lord, she used to provoke her. Therefore Hannah wept and would not eat. And Elkanah, her husband, said to her, Hannah, why do you weep? And why do you not eat? And why is your heart sad? Am I not more to you than 10 sons? So just from that passage that we read there, what do we know about Elkanah? What can you tell me about this man, Elkanah? Okay. Why do you say that, Rachel? Okay. So you might have phrased that differently. Yeah, we'll get to that in a second. What else can you tell me about Elkanah? We're not given much here. Okay, why do you say that? Yes. So I agree. So he's a bit obtuse with the situation. He doesn't quite get what's going on, but he seems to mean well. What else? Anything else you can tell me about Elkanah? Yes, ma'am. Excellent. Yeah. So he's consistent and he's obedient, right? He's trying to serve. He goes every year. Yes, John. Okay. So there's some contradictoriness to him, we'll say. Is that fair? It says he goes to Shiloh. It just as an aside, we could probably talk a long time about Shiloh, but Shiloh was in Samaria, and so this is where the tabernacle and the ark were located for about 300 years during this period of time. You can go back to Judges 21 and read where this is where they set up the tabernacle, and so this is where the feast would be occurring, and so someone like Elkanah would go there yearly to fulfill obligations. And again, as it was pointed out, he's consistent in his obedience, so he's got some redeeming qualities. You can imagine what kind of stressor this has become to Elkanah, right? So he it's never said explicitly, but multiple commentaries seem to infer, and you can reasonably draw the conclusion that it's likely he married Hannah, and she wasn't able to provide children, and so then he marries Peninnah, who does have children. And it doesn't say that explicitly, so I can't say that with confidence. But, what does he have between these two wives? Well, he has children, but it's also introduced this huge dilemma for himself, right, in terms of the strife that's going on in this house. And I'll also go ahead and say here that, this situation that Hannah is in, we could turn to example after example of barrenness or infertility or whatever you want to call it in the Old Testament. This is not something new, and it seems like it's so routine because you think about Abram and Sarah, you think about Jacob and Rachel. We could think of other examples, so this seems somewhat common. But, and I don't mean to belittle what infertility is like for couples experience that this day and age, but back then this would have been a huge deal, right? Because for a woman in this culture to not have children, I mean, this is how they kind of define themselves. Not just having children, but especially having male children, right? That was the importance, was having a male child who an inheritance would pass through down to the male children. So the fact that she can't have children, this is just an astronomically distressing situation for her. Without children, without a son, there's really no one for inheritance to pass down to. So now answer me this: how does Elkanah treat his two wives? We've already talked about it a little bit, but how is he differentiating between the two of them? Yes. So it says that after they would do these sacrifices in Shiloh, he would give a double portion to Hannah. And so you pause here and you imagine the situation where they're sitting at the table, and he has Hannah on one side, and he has Peninnah on the other side, and all of her children. And he's taking the food, and he says, here's one for you, and here's one for you, and here's one for you, and here's one for you. And then they look across the table, and here he goes, here's twice as much for you, Hannah. But notice, was Hannah eating at the time? No, she wasn't eating. So they get done eating, and Hannah's got all this food, and she's not touching any of it. And so you can just imagine what this is like. I don't mean to put words in Peninnah's mouth, but you can imagine the sentiment of her looking at Elkanah like, I know you love her more than you love me. Look at all the stuff you give her. You give her twice as much as you give me. What do you even think about me? And you can imagine this conversation she's having with Hannah, this provocation that's described for us. It says that this happens on their way to sacrifice. So you imagine this conversation like, Peninnah says to Hannah, why are you going to sacrifice? What has God done for you? He hasn't given you any children. Can you imagine this back and forth that would have been going on? Not just a one-time thing, but year after year going to make these sacrifices. And Peninnah's just saying, what are you here for? So why is this so tough for Hannah? If we zoom out, there's this gap between her head and her heart. And we're really going to see this in some of her actions and her prayer here in a little bit. But it becomes clear that Hannah knows how she's supposed to feel in this situation, right? It becomes clear, and again, we're going to read this, that she knows God is going to keep his promises. She knows that God is providential. And yet, at the same time, there's this contradiction because she knows what she's living out every day. Right? She knows that every year she has to hear this from Peninnah, and they're living in the same house, and she sees, what she's able to provide for Elkanah and that she can't. And so then, I appreciate Rachel bringing up, then you kind of notice Elkanah being a typical man. Why do you weep? Why do you not eat? Why is your heart sad? Am I not more to you than 10 sons? So does he really not understand why she's upset? Surely, right? Surely he would understand this. But yeah, poor choice of words. I would caution myself and other husbands here before you ask your wife a question, am I not worth more to you than ... Careful that you know what you're asking, because just not a great word. Now, on the other hand, if he had said something like, you are worth more to me than 10 sons, well, there's something that might communicate a different sentiment to his wife. He was proud of himself? Yeah. All right, let's keep reading here. Verse 9. After they had eaten and drunk in Shiloh, Hannah rose. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat beside the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. She was deeply distressed and prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. And she vowed a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your servant, and remember me and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall touch his head. So we have this change in scenery now. She's no longer in this conflicted situation. If you're imagining this as a play, she's no longer getting these questions from Peninnah and all this provocation, and she's no longer getting these questions from her husband, who doesn't really get what's going on, and now she's in the quiet of this the tabernacle, and she's here to pray to God. So we're going to dive into the things that she says and her actions here in a little bit. But before we do that, how else might Hannah have responded to this situation? What are some other, paint for me some alternative scenarios that you could have imagined, maybe not Hannah, but just someone in this situation reacting. How else might this have gone? What's that? Yes, rejection and dejection, right? So almost like this kind of fatalistic, what am I going to do about this? What does it even matter? God's not listening to me. Year after year, I'm not getting a child. I give up. Absolutely. Right, so she doesn't give up, right? She keeps, that's exactly right. How else might Hannah or someone have reacted in the situation, Perry? Right. Right. So it's not that she kind of just gives up. She goes to God and pours all this out to him. How else might she have reacted? Peninnah. Right. Yeah, so that would have been, that's low-hanging fruit, right? Just lash out at the person that's causing the provocation and is belittling and saying these things, taking it out on her. Absolutely. Yes, ma'am. God's not going to do this, so I'll do it myself. Right. Sure. Yeah. Absolutely. I was thinking back when I was preparing for this, and I was thinking back to VBS from this past year when Kenny Moore was here. And his first lesson on that Sunday morning was he was talking about some of the big questions that we all grapple with. He was talking about identity, origin, and purpose. So he said, who am I? Who put me here? And why am I here? And he goes back to Genesis 1, and he was talking about the Garden of Eden, and we're made in the image of God, and how we answer those questions through God. But you can imagine some of those questions swirling around for Hannah, right? Like, why am I here, God? Why did you put me here and I can't have children? Why am I in this situation? And that's, I think, something that we can really generalize for ourselves here, right? We've all been in these type situations, even if it's not infertility. We've all been distressed about looking for a spouse, or in some kind of relationship issue with a family member, or a relationship issue at work, and we think, man, why am I in this situation? Why did God put me in this situation? I know he promises all these things to me, but why am I still struggling with this? And as we've said, how does Hannah react to this? Well, she takes all these emotions, and she doesn't lash out at Peninnah, and she doesn't just give up. She doesn't take this fatalistic approach of say, well, what does it matter? She brings all of this and she just lays it at God's feet. And she knows her head is where it needs to be, and she knows how she's supposed to feel about this. And she just, through prayer, tries to bring all this to God. Let's look at her prayer again here in verse 11. O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your servant and remember me and not forget your servant, but will give your servant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life. So was she trying to create some kind of quid pro quo where, God, if you'll do this for me, then I will do this for you? Do you think this was kind of like some kind of negotiate? Do you think she was trying to negotiate with God? mean, it kind of reads that way, but I don't think, right. We're going to see through what Hannah continues to say here that, no, she's saying, God, you are all-powerful. That expression, the Lord of hosts, connotes this idea of the Lord of all the armies, the many of many's, the God over everything, not just some things, but God over everything. And we're going to see, as we keep reading here, just how much faith she has in God's providence, and how she, I'm asking you to lift me out of this, and here's where my heart is at. Yeah, Barry.
We think that a mother's love
Right.
but saying, I will give you.
Right. So almost like a selflessness aspect to that. It's not even for me. I'm going to put him in your service, God, if you'll.
Willing to go to the
Right. Verse 12, as she continued praying before the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was speaking in her heart, only her lips moved, and her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli took her to be a drunken woman. And Eli said to her, how long will you go on being drunk? Put your wine away from you. But Hannah answered, no, my Lord, I am a woman troubled in spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have been pouring out my soul before the Lord. Do not regard your servant as a worthless woman, for all along I have been speaking out of my great anxiety and vexation. Then Eli answered, go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition that you have made to him. And she said, let your servant find favor in your eyes. Then the woman went her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad. So, interesting twist here, right? So Eli comes along. He's not just anybody. He's a priest. He's also a judge. And he's been judging, right? He's been sitting, watching, and making some judgments about what he thinks he's seeing. We're going to see in the next chapter, it's not actually Hannah. She defends herself and says, I'm not a worthless woman. Who are we going to find out are some worthless individuals? His sons. That's right. So it's not Hannah that's the worthless one. And it's interesting, right, that we see almost the same judgment being made on the day of Pentecost, right, that they thought that Peter and the apostles were drunk. And so Hannah has to explain, no, I'm not worthless. I've not been drinking. I'm just very discouraged. And so Eli wishes that the Lord will grant her request. And then you have this change in her disposition, right? She eats. She's not been eating. She eats. Her face is no longer sad. And so what has she done? She has brought this grief and this situation to God, and she has given it to him. And just from praying to God and giving this to him, she's no longer feeling like she was, right? Even before we find out that her prayer is going to be answered, her appetite returns, she's no longer sad. We're not going to turn there, but I really feel like this is a great demonstration of, say, 1 Peter 5, 6, 7, casting all your anxieties on him because he cares for you. Or Philippians 4, 6, don't be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication, let your requests be known to God, and the peace will guard your hearts and minds. She's poured out everything to him, and she understands that, whether or not God gives me this child, this is God's decision. So can you draw any conclusions about Hannah and her faith just based on what we've read thus far? What kind of faith would you say Hannah has? Would you say, and more specifically, do you think that all of the crying and the tears and everything she was going through, do you think that demonstrated a lack of faith? No. I'm sorry? Confident. Yeah. Right. I agree. Early the next morning, they arose and worshiped before the Lord, then went back to their home in Ramah. Elkanah made love to his wife Hannah, and the Lord remembered her. So in the course of time, Hannah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, saying, because I asked the Lord for him. So Hannah goes home, she conceives, she has a baby, and it said that the Lord remembered her plea. That phraseology, the Lord remembered, is not obviously suggesting that God had forgotten, but that's used oftentimes in Scripture it's wrapped up in this idea of God acting according to his covenant promises. So it's used a lot in, say, remembering the covenant that he made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so they worship, God remembers, Hannah conceives, and then Samuel arrives. 21. When her husband Elkanah went up with all his family to offer the annual sacrifice to the Lord and to fulfill his vow, Hannah did not go. She said to her husband, "After the boy is weaned, I will take him and present him before the Lord, and he will live there always. Do what seems best to you," her husband Elkanah told her. "Stay here until you've weaned him. Only may the Lord make good his word." So the woman stayed at home and nursed her son until she had weaned him. So she's made this vow. It's not the right time yet for her to take him. I want us just to pause and think about the humanity of this situation, right? So, Hannah was a real person. This was a real story. This was a real baby that she was holding, whom she's nursing, who she's up in the middle of the night nursing. I don't know what they had instead of diapers, but she's changing those in the middle of the night. And you can just imagine her holding this baby and talking to Samuel and saying, "I love you so much. I prayed so much for you. I wanted you more than anything. And now God's given you to me. And one day I'm going to give you away, but it's because I love you, but it's because I love the Lord. And I promised him that I would do this." And so, I don't know, I think it's pretty moving to think about this relationship and what that must have been like those few years before she took him, knowing what she was going to be required to do to fulfill her vow. I'm sorry, I haven't advanced a single slide. There's not much there. All right. Verse 24, after he was weaned, she took the boy with her, young as he was, along with a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a skin of wine, and brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh. When the bull had been sacrificed, they brought the boy to Eli, and she said to him, "Pardon me, my Lord, as surely as you live, I'm the woman who stood here beside you, praying to the Lord. I prayed for this child. The Lord has granted me what I asked of him, so now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life he will be given over to the Lord." And he worshiped the Lord there. So she returns to Shiloh. She has Samuel, and they're bringing this thank offering, and she reminds Eli of who she is and gives Samuel back to God in his service. We're going to move on here to chapter 2 in just a second, but I just want to make the point here that there are some obvious, pretty straightforward examples, Elkanah was consistent in obeying God. Hannah was certainly a great example of someone who was really thoughtful in her prayer and really didn't become fatalistic and didn't become vengeful and brought all this to God, and God answered her prayer. But I also do think there's a larger point here from verse 23 when it says that Elkanah said to her, "Stay here until you've weaned him. Only may the Lord make good his word." I don't know, but I have some suspicions that, do you think Hannah had any inkling that this was more than just about her? Right? Because I'm sure there were I don't know, but I wonder if there were other women who were in a similar situation who were making prayers to God in a similar vein. But it wasn't just, this story is not just about Hannah having a baby because she prayed for it. This story is about how the nation of Israel ultimately, goes on to fulfill God's promises, right? We know what a role Samuel's going to play in that. And so this has a much larger effect than just the immediacy of Hannah and what she was praying for. Yeah.
Girl, Mary, who is going to give birth to this child, and child comes to the world, she has to give him over to God and then let him be the Savior that he's supposed to be, the Messiah that he's supposed to be. And you just imagine the conversation, as you pointed out, that Hannah was having with Samuel during those years. You just imagine the conversation that Mary was having.
Right.
And things that she was teaching him, but also she was having to. And so there's a parallel here of faith in Hannah and faith in Mary.
Absolutely. We're going to read Hannah's prayer here in just a second, and you won't just find this prayer here. You'll find bits of this prayer from, I'm sure, as you know, from Mary quotes these bits and pieces of this prayer that Hannah's going to pray. She quotes it in Luke chapter 1. So, perfect analogy there. All right. So we've seen this predicament that Hannah was in. We've seen how God provides for her, and it's clear from her prayers that she's convinced of God's providence. So let's read here, starting in the second chapter. And Hannah prayed and said, "My heart exults in the Lord, my horn is exalted in the Lord. My mouth derides my enemies, because I rejoice in your salvation. There is none like the Lord, for there is none beside you. There is no rock like our God." So she starts out and kind of reflects on what God has done for her. There's these, it divides nicely, these three my's, my horn, my mouth, and I lost my place. My horn, my mouth, and my... There's another one, I used the wrong translation. I think it's my God. My heart, yeah. So my heart. So, we've actually been thinking about this. This is timely, right? We've been thinking about the heart the last couple of weeks here in our new quarter. I wrote down, Scott last week on his sermon, it said, "A reflective heart learns to find permanent joy from a sustainable source." A reflective heart learns to find permanent joy from a sustainable source. So had Hannah found permanent joy from a sustainable source? I would say yes. As she says here, her heart's elated in God. She's reflecting on this joy that God has given to her. And that's how she defines herself, right? She doesn't define herself here as a mother. She doesn't define herself as someone who's barren. She defines herself as belonging to God. My horn is exalted. So that is used in the Bible to connote this idea of strength. Our strength comes from God. Verse 3, "Talk no more so very proudly. Let not arrogance come from your mouth, for the Lord is a God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed." So now she focuses on what God is currently doing. And not only is God holy and powerful, but he's a God of knowledge, and he weighs men's actions. By him, actions are weighed. This is reminiscent back to Belshazzar. You remember that story? So Daniel chapter 5, he's having a feast, and he's using all these things that have been stolen from the temple. And this hand appears, and it writes on the wall. And he tries to figure out what it means, and they summon Daniel, and Daniel says, "Well, God wrote this. And he wrote it because you're rejecting him. And you haven't humbled your heart. And you know that God rules over heaven and earth, but you haven't humbled yourself." And so then it says, "You have been weighed on the scales and found wanting." Right? So there's an illustration of God weighing men's actions. And then she goes on in the rest of this prayer. We're not going to read the next 7 verses, but kind of going through there, the rest of the section is kind of Hannah listing ways that turns human logic upside down, right? So the mighty aren't strong, they're actually weak, verse 4. And the weak, they become strong. We're going to see that in a few chapters with regards to the Philistines, right? It's not because David was more powerful than all those men. It's because God was using someone weak and making him strong. Verse 5, the full become hungry, the hungry become full. The barren bear many children, and the one with children is forlorn. Poor become rich, the rich become poor. Verse 8, he raises the poor from the dust, the needy from the ash heap. Had Hannah experienced something like this? Had she been in an ash heap, you might say so? And has God raised her out of this situation because of his plans for her? So what's the point that Hannah is making in this prayer? Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. So this idea of thankfulness to God for answering her prayer, sure, I think that's part of it. What other points do you think we can take away from this prayer that Hannah's making? He can do anything? Yeah, absolutely. Sure. He raised her out of this situation that seemed hopeless. It's all in God's hands. Absolutely. So should we just be fatalistic because God's determined some people are going to be rich and some people are going to be poor, so why should I even try? And God's going to determine some people are going to have kids and some people aren't, so what does it even matter? No, I think it's this idea that God is in control and God is constant in his faithfulness, right? So whatever situation we find ourselves in, God's in control. I don't think I read it, but the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and on them he has set the world. That's hard for me to conceptualize, but it sounds like something illustrating God being in control. God created this world, and it's entirely within his control. She finishes verse 9 and 10 by talking about what God's going to do in the future. So he says, he will guard the feet of his faithful ones, but the wicked shall be cut off in darkness. For not by might shall a man prevail. The adversaries of the Lord shall be broken to pieces. Against them he will thunder in heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. Then Elkanah went home to Ramah, and the boy was ministering to the Lord in the presence of Eli the priest. So she prays about this day of separation that God's going to, he's got work to do in the future, and faithful ones will be guarded and wicked ones will be cut off. I've already mentioned the fact that, Mary quotes some of this prayer before she gives birth to Jesus. Actually, Zechariah, father of John the Baptist, quotes portions of this prayer, also in Luke chapter 1. So Hannah goes home. She leaves Samuel, and now we kind of turn our attention to Levi. And the rest of this chapter is kind of this split screen where we're going to focus on Eli and his sons and their behavior, but then you'll notice that a few times there's just kind of like these sprinkling of, and Samuel was doing what he was supposed to do, and Samuel was ministering to the Lord. So if it feels like we're kind of jumping back and forth, it kind of goes back and forth. So verse 12, it says, now the sons of Eli were worthless men. They did not know the Lord. So there's already been a passing reference to them back in the beginning of chapter 1, right? And we're told that they're priests. So, their whole lives have been kind of wrapped up in this religious establishment, right? They would have had tasks and jobs to do. And what does it mean that they did not know the Lord? Who wants to take a stab at that? What do you think that means? Right. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah, I agree. I wrote down they were involved in his service, but they had no relationship with him. I thought about Matthew chapter 7, where these people, it says the people who know, the people who know Jesus are the people who do the will of my Father, right? Get away from me, I never knew you. The people who know him are the people that were doing his will. We were talking about Pharaoh on Sunday, right? Scott was talking about Pharaoh on Sunday. In Exodus 5, Pharaoh says, who is the Lord that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I won't let Israel go. So they were, so that's kind of sobering, right? These people knew who God was, and they were involved in the religious establishment. They were, they had roles, but they didn't know the Lord. So I'm going to summarize what they were doing here, verses 13 through 17. So God obviously had given very, very explicit instructions about how their work was supposed to be done and how these sacrifices were supposed to be offered, and what portion would go to the priest and what portion would be burned. And so what they're doing here is they've got this servant who is executing this plan that they have, where he walks around with this, it sounds like a three-pronged fork, basically, and I know this is going to sound ridiculous, but it sounds like a fondue, right? Like he's like stabbing it in this boiling water and trying to get meat out of the boiling water. And that's what they tell him, is they say, just put it in and get whatever you can. We won't turn to the passages to illustrate this, but suffice it to say that that's not what the plan was. That's not what God had prescribed. There were very certain portions that could be allotted to the priest, and they had to be prepared a certain way. And it wasn't that they were just doing this one time, right? They were doing this over and over again. It said that this is what they did to all the Israelites who came there. So not only are they taking the food the wrong way, but they're actually not following the instructions about what was supposed to be God. So the fat was supposed to be burned off as this pleasing aroma to God, and they're not even allowing that to happen. So they're getting this kind of raw portions that haven't been burned. The fat hasn't been burned off. And they're telling the guy to use force. And so then it says, thus the sin of the young men was very great in the sight of the Lord, for they treated the offering of the Lord with contempt. We have one of these breaks and a change in the mood. Verse 18, Samuel was ministering before the Lord, a boy clothed with a linen ephod, and his mother used to make for him a little robe and take it to him each year when she went up with her husband to offer the yearly sacrifice. Then Eli would bless Elkanah and his wife and say, "May the Lord give you children by this woman for the petition she asked of the Lord." So then they would return to their home. So you have this stark contrast, right? You've got Hophni and Phinehas who have this father who is either inattentive or absent and not correcting this behavior. And then you have Samuel who has this mom who's doing all the right things and has the right heart. Before we go back to Hophni and Phinehas, I just want us to think and pause again about the humanity of this story with Hannah, right? So she's going every year, and previously, before she has him, every year it's this time of pain because she's getting ridiculed and she's having to hear from Peninnah, and she's getting all these provocations. And now her circumstances have changed, and now she goes and she gets to see her son there ministering for the Lord. And you just imagine the forethought and the planning and the anticipation. And she's making this garment for him, so you can imagine her like having these conversations with Elkanah, like, how much do you think he's grown this year? How long do you think I should make the sleeves? Did she compare other children who were born around the same time to kind of get an idea of how big to make this garment for him? And so it's this really emotional experience, I'm sure, for her to be thinking about and the anticipation of going to see him each year. And then I'm running out of time. He goes back to Eli. So now Eli was very old, and he kept hearing all that his sons were doing to all Israel. They lay with women who were serving at the entrance to the tent, and he said to them, "Why do you do such things? For I hear of your evil dealings from all these people. No, my sons, it is no good report that I hear the people of the Lord spreading abroad. If someone sins against a man, God will mediate for him. But if someone sins against the Lord, who can intercede for him?" But they would not listen to the voice of their father, for it was the will of the Lord to put them to death. And so you've got people supposed to be coming to the tent to offer sacrifices. Instead, people are coming to the tabernacle to commit sin. And it's almost like this kind of too little, too late on behalf of Eli. What do you think it means when he says, if someone sins against man, God will mediate, but if someone sins against the Lord, who can intercede? Yeah, I think God had made provisions to address their sin, and if they're rejecting the provision God has made, then what else is there? It's kind of like, we could turn to a lot of passages in Hebrews, but Hebrews 10, if we go on sinning deliberately after having knowledge of the truth, there's no longer remains a sacrifice for sin, but a fearful expectation of judgment. If we reject the method God has given us to address our sin, then what other avenue is there? So you get this picture of willful sinfulness. We could also turn to Romans 1. I think there are good examples of what you read about in Romans 1, who God just gives up to their passions and lusts. So God kind of gives up Hophni and Phinehas because they are rejecting God's method for forgiveness. Verse 26, now the boy Samuel continued to grow both in stature and in favor with the Lord and also with man. So Samuel, again, one of these interludes where Samuel's continuing to grow. So then we're introduced to this man who comes to Eli, and we're not really told anything about him except that he brings the word of God, and he asks some questions. Did I indeed reveal myself to the house of your father when they were in Egypt? Did I indeed reveal myself to the house of your father when they were in Egypt, subject to the house of Pharaoh? Yes. Did I choose him out of all the tribes of Israel to be my priest, to go up to my altar, to burn incense, to wear an ephod before me? Once again, yes, so the priest has three things they do. They go to the altar, they burn incense, and they wear these special garments. And so then he reminds them, verse 28, I gave to the house of your father all my offerings by fire from the people of Israel. So, kind of rhetorically, these questions, did I not do all these things for you and tell you exactly what to do? Yes. So then verse 29, so then why then do you scorn my sacrifices and my offerings that I commanded for my dwelling, and honor your sons above me by fattening yourselves on the choicest parts of every offering of my people Israel? To paraphrase, I have done all these things for you. I have been so good to you. I have given you exact specifications about what to do. why would you make light of these privileges? Why would you abuse the situation that I had put you in? Why would you treat your sons better than you treat me? Why would you let them treat these instructions that I've given you as nothing and show contempt for this very process that's at the center of our relationship, of how you're supposed to come to me? If you go back into Deuteronomy 17, if you were to scorecard the behavior of Hophni and Phinehas and how they had not listened to their father and how they were not observing what the priest had instructed them to do, the consequences of that behavior is death. Right? That's what their actions deserved based on their behavior. And Eli had not addressed this behavior. And so, once again, kind of a sobering thought there for us. Like, God has given us all these privileges. God has given us all these instructions. Will we be like Hophni and Phinehas? Will we not follow what God has given us after He's given us all these instructions and all these blessings? Yes, sir. Mm. Yeah, so he was willing to make that sacrifice. Verse 30, therefore the Lord, the God of Israel, declares, I promise that your house and the house of your father should go in and out before me forever. But now the Lord declares, far be it from me, for those who honor me I will honor. Those who despise me shall be lightly esteemed. Behold, the days are coming when I will cut off your strength and the strength of your father's house, so there will not be an old man in your house. So Eli's about to realize that even though God had made these promises to the house of Aaron, that things are about to change with regards to the family of Eli, right? And we're going to see in the next few chapters that that God's going to fulfill these prophecies, or what He tells him is going to happen. Verse 34, then shall come upon your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, shall be the sign to you. Both of them shall die on the same day. We know that's going to happen in chapter 4. And then, it ends on at least a positive note. Verse 35, and I will raise up for myself a faithful priest who shall do according to what is in my heart and in my mind, and I will build him a sure house, and he shall go in and out before my anointed forever. So, of course, we eventually know how this is going to be fulfilled, ultimately in Jesus. Any thoughts as we wrap up here? Yeah.
It kind of follows the pattern that all throughout Samuel, which is that you have an arrogant person on a throne, or in this case, he's seated as a priest/judge. He does something, or someone connected to him does something, and he's got a prophet that comes to him and says, you need to either change this or something's going to happen. But in this case, he's told, you can't change it. Even if you change it right now, it's still not going to make any difference, because he's been arrogant this entire time, basically. And so it just follows that same pattern.
Right.
That if you are arrogant and you're not even willing to, then God's going to judge you for that arrogance.
Yeah, the window of opportunity for correcting this behavior had closed, right? The opportunity for Eli to do something about this had closed, and so now God's telling him the consequences of his actions. Yeah, Greg. Mm. Right. Yeah, and certainly I'm sure elaborating on what her, God answering her prayers and what He had done for her in doing that. Thanks everybody for your participation. Really appreciate it. We'll continue in chapters 3 through 6-ish, 3 through 7.